Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. As you can see, my name is Joe Nagel. I'm Innovation Director at the Innovation Beehive, and I'm joined by Zach Curtis, who's on the other picture. Say hi, Zach.
Hi, Zach.
Very good. Zach makes a habit of being funny. Before we move on from this slide, I just wanted to share that just before the call, I said to Zach, so what was your thinking behind the image that's on the screen? Are you going to suggest that we all make a habit of staring at walls? He actually has used this image very well, because what it shows is a repetitive pattern, a slightly formulaic process pattern, but actually there's an element of creativity in it. There's a burst of energy in it. There's light in it. It's dynamic. So what we're talking about today is creating positive habits that create a dynamic leadership. And that is the purpose of that image. So Zach, can I have the next slide, please?
You certainly can.
Just a whistle-stop overview. I think most of you already know us at the Innovation Beehive, but we are the Innovation Beehive. We accelerate the potential of ideas, of leaders, of organizations, and of organizational culture. And we do that in three ways. We apply the innovation process, that's human-centered design. So if you're holding one of these, if you're watching on a screen, design thinking, human-centered design is what went into developing the tool that you're using to engage with us today. If you've ever used an app on your phone, design thinking was used to develop that app. But we apply that process to people challenges, to organizational challenges, and to leadership challenges. So we focus on innovation, culture, and leadership. And we accelerate the potential of organizations in all of those fields. And on the next slide, you'll see just a snapshot of the organizations that we work with. And this isn't just about sort of blowing our own trumpet or making our heads so big that we no longer fit on screen. This is because we're really proud of all the people we've worked with. But this is also to show that actually the leadership that we're going to talk about today is universal. It's drawn from our work with leaders right across this range of industries, right across this range of sectors. We've got heavy industry, we've got energy, we've got service sector, we've got charity sector, we've got technology sector, financial services, education. All of these sectors have fed into the research that has led us to develop Leadership 4.0, of which leading in habit is an integral part. So Zach, if I can get the next slide. Now, I can see a number of you on the call today have joined us for this series on leadership in uncertain times. And at the end, I'll share a link for you to access previous recordings if you haven't seen them already, and also to register for the final webinar in this series. But just a whistle-stop tour of the context in which we're operating right now. You know, we all know, I don't need to tell you that we're in the midst of a pandemic and hopefully coming out of it, fingers crossed. But the unprecedented uncertainty that has wrought on our economies, on our personal lives, on our social lives, and on our inner lives, you know, the feelings and the emotions that we've experienced over the last year have been completely unprecedented and completely different from anything that we experienced before. And my colleague Angela and I talked about that last week when we focused on leading in health, another of the practices in Leadership 4.0. Definitely check that webinar out if you're thinking about building positive habits for your leadership. So there's that uncertainty, the uncertainty of the pandemic. There's also the uncertainty of emerging climate change and what that is going to do to the way we work, the way we consume, the way we operate in a sort of almost like a geopolitical macro terms, how that's going to change things over the next years and decades. You know, by 2030, we should all be buying electric cars. That's a huge shift in the way we work and live. There's changes in the way that we consume and the way our customers interact with us as businesses. Top right corner, you can see someone doing some online shopping. What are the changes that's going to make to hospitality, to retail, to the service sector, where things are going to become perhaps more automated, more real-time communication via chat boxes, for example, rather than telephone calls, rather than face-to-face. Just think about the way the banking sector has changed over the last 10 to 15 years. Changes to the way we work, bottom left. You know, we're on a Zoom call right now. We are interacting from wherever we are. I know there's someone on here from Japan. I'm in London, Zach's in Gloucestershire, wherever the rest of you are. You know, we are coming in from where we are, different time zones, different weather. I sent someone a message earlier saying, I hope you're enjoying the sunshine, and then thought, actually, she's in the north of England. I've no idea what the weather's like up there. But, you know, we're going to have to get used to this way of working, and particularly as we start coming back to work, to get used to hybrid ways of working, and perhaps form new habits to lead our teams in those changing times and those changing circumstances. There's changes to the way we socialize. You know, we've got a picture there of people in a pub, having a drink, wearing masks. So, you know, what are the impact? What's the way that the world is changing? What is the impact of that going to have on hospitality, on the way we socialize as teams, and also in our family lives? How is that going to change? And actually, the last picture on this slide, digital disruption. I went to an incredible event yesterday at the Royal Opera House of all places, and it was a virtual reality experience, a 15-minute opera, wearing a VR goggles and a backpack computer on my back. And I was immersed in another world. And it just got me thinking how far this has come from, you know, sitting for 3 hours listening to Wagner or listening to a piano concerto at the Royal Albert Hall or whatever music is your taste. I've been into another world for 15 minutes, and it was the most incredible experience I think I've ever had. And I feel like I have touched what that person is doing there. It actually felt how that picture looks. And, you know, so often you see pictures like this and kind of think, wow, this is just graphic design gone wild. But actually, it does feel how that picture captures it. The essence of it is there. So it's quite incredible. But that's not the only kind of digital disruption. There's machine learning, there's artificial intelligence, there's the Internet of Things. All of these things are going to change the way we work as teams. They're going to change the nature of leadership. You know, will leaders all be data scientists? Hope not. But you know, what will leadership look like in an ever-changing world where digital disruption is the new norm, is the next normal and the next normal and a constant? What does the world look like when disruption is a constant? And our answer to that is Leadership 4.0, because actually in these times of challenge and uncertainty, people need something different from their leaders. So if I can have the next slide, Zach. What we've identified through our research is that really people need 5 things from their leaders. They need trust, they need credibility, they need compassion, they need stability, and they need hope. And these 5 things collectively can be delivered when leaders operate in the Leadership 4.0 framework with the 5 principles of Leadership 4.0, and particularly what we're going to be talking about today, which is leading in habit. Because if you think about things like credibility, things like stability, things like trust, well, how can you build trust, compassion, and stability if you are not making a habit and a regular habit of being a great leader for your people, of being the leader that your people need? Only when you're doing that can you build trust, credibility, and stability. And then from that stability, from that credibility, and from that trust, you can give hope to your people because they know they're being led well. And you can show compassion because you can make being a compassionate leader a part of the habit that you form. So Zach, we just whiz on to the next slide. Just give a top line introduction to Leadership 4.0. As I said earlier, there is going to be a link in the chat box, which I'll just post again for those who've joined since we started. So there's a link in the chat box to the homepage of the Innovation Beehive. You'll find a link to the white paper immediately on the homepage. And then underneath that, there's also a scorecard around Leadership 4.0 that you can try. But the crucial thing to know as we dive into the content of Leading in Habit is that there are 5 practices that leaders in uncertain times, leaders who excel in uncertain times, adopt. So there's leading in head, which is making sure that you've got the facts and the strategy and the operational effectiveness to do the job well. There's leading in heart, which is about empathy and a sense of purpose and a sense of compassion and a sense of understanding our customer. There's leading in health, which is looking after yourself, yes, but it is also about role modeling that healthy leadership, that healthy way of operating, so that your teams can also feel empowered and enabled and inspired to lead their own healthy lives. And then there's leading in habit, which in a sense draws those 3 together, because when you focus on leading in head, heart, and health, if you don't just do it in the context of a webinar on leadership, but you actually make a habit of it, then you're excelling at leading in habit. And those 4, when you're doing those really well, they enable you to lead in history. And leading in history means focusing on your purpose, focusing on your values, and actually delivering and making a difference to the world. And we're going to be covering that in the webinar that we're running 2 weeks today. So there'll be a link to register for that at the end of the webinar if you're interested. But right now, as I say, we're focusing on leading in habit. So I am delighted to reintroduce Zach Curtis, Capability Director at the Innovation Beehive, who is going to take us through leading in habit. Zach, over to you.
So you're delighted to reintroduce. That's very exciting. So yes, hello everyone listening wherever you are in the world, and hello Joe. Great to, well, I can't see everybody, but I can see you, Joe, which is marvelous. But imagine, everyone, imagine a time when you are so on top of different tasks, of different projects, of leading in head, of leading in heart. You know, your life and work seem to be absolutely balanced because certain things happen automatically or subconsciously, or it could be that your team is engaged by your habitual actions as a leader, so that your goals are achieved on time and efficiently, or whatever it is you need to get done. This webinar is a chance to reflect on some of those habits that you like, which work for you, which you might be able to think, how can we enhance them or grow them in some way to become even more positive, or those habits which are not working for you that you want to change. And do feel free to type into the chat or the Q&A any questions that you might have as we go along. We'll do our best to answer them. But there are a few different areas we need to look at. The first thing is when we think about leading in habit, there are 4 separate areas which are very, very important. The first one here is that Leadership 4.0 leaders, they need to have a really high level of self-awareness. They need to know their strengths, their weaknesses, their motivations. They need to know when they're being their best, and they need to know when they need support or downtime, as Joe was talking about with leading in health, and also role modeling at that. But they also need to be good at being curious, to knowing what they could do better or what their team could do better so that they can make the habit of developing them as they go along. They're habitual questioners, observers, experimenters. They want to know how things work. They want to know what people need, what they're motivated by, what's changing in their industry and what's happening in their customers' world. They're continually seeking for new information, and they make that an absolute habit. They also provide consistency, both for themselves and for their teams and the people around them, including customers. Because they know who they are, what they stand for, they know what to expect from them, but yet they're also adaptable. They're constantly learning. So it's not just about having a habit which stays in one place. It's about continually reevaluating that habit and making it stronger and stronger, flexing how they work to meet new challenges, to try new ideas, to improve their impact. And that ability to know what to keep consistent and when to adapt is the key for forming good habits. We're going to look at a bit more behind the, let's call it science light, the light version of the science behind habits, and how we can then adjust it as we move forwards. But developing good habits means that we do great things naturally, consistently, so we can preserve our energy for what's really needed in business, but also at home. And one of the reasons for flagging that is because, of course, there are good habits and there are bad habits. Now, I don't know if you can see Joe's face right now, but I'm looking at his face and I see his mind automatically went to some of the bad habits that he has. Now, I personally never used to like the word habit. Now, my history is in the corporate world, in HR, learning and development and sales. And of course, I've picked up lots of bad habits along the way. And I started to consider why I never liked that word. Well, habit, for me at least, is very often linked to negative because it's about doing things over and over again. But of course, those things can be positive. You can do positive things over and over again. So just to get us warmed up, do feel free to type into the chat. Well, not even do feel free, do type into the chat. We're going to try and start a habit of typing into the chat. Some of the habits you've recognized in leaders and managers, perhaps in yourself, but perhaps in leaders and managers that you've had in the past, without saying whether or not they're good or bad, just things that you've observed. And then we'll perhaps, we won't call out on you particularly, but we'll call out on some of the things that you've signaled. So Joe, just to put you on the spot, while people are typing in, have you come across anything in particular?
And you want me to say this without saying whether I think it's a good or bad habit, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Partly. Yeah, I should probably just flag why we're not going to call that out. And that's because one thing, Joe, which you might think is a bad habit in a leader might actually be, I might think is a reasonable habit. For example, micromanaging. If that's the way that I like to be managed, then that would work for me.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try not to convey my thoughts on this habit in the tone with which I say it. I once had a manager who read all of the emails that I sent externally.
Wow.
Mm.
I mean, my mind immediately jumped to, well, that's not a very good habit.
I was desperately trying not to put the tone into it. We've actually got some comments coming through already. So telling me how busy they are, being gossipy about other departments, taking time to check in with me about my personal as well as professional life. There's some interesting habits there. Asking me, what can I do to help make this happen? So so my manager asking me, what can I do to make
that's quite good. That's quite supportive, quite a supportive habit. Again, we're not saying, we shouldn't be saying whether it's good or bad, because again, for some people it might be different. We've got a couple more coming in. Micromanaging, yes, I mentioned that before. Giving feedback, very good.
Yeah, giving autonomy and confidence in team decisions. Thank you. Yeah. What can asking? Oh, sorry, just that one about asking what I can do. Say the manager saying, what can I as the manager do to make this happen? So it's sort of offering their support and help. Trusting me to manage my own time as long as I get the results for her. Yeah. How about you, Zach? What examples of habits have you seen in previous managers?
Yeah, so I should signal it's not linked to the organization that I work for now. The Innovation Beehive. So yeah, a couple of things which came to mind was not role modeling. In a previous, sometime in the past, with no defined time, someone, a leader, not being clear on how they were spending their own time. So they were quite authoritative. They would tell people what to do, and then who knows what they were doing during the day? It's a mystery. They were kind of out of action. They could have been sunning themselves on the beach, but it wasn't very motivating, to me at least.
One of the learnings that I'm taking from this conversation is that it's quite easy to tell from, well, certainly from my perspective, it's quite easy to tell what you or what people are typing think are good habits and not good habits from the way that they describe them. So to give an example of one that's written, somebody commented being gossipy about other departments. Now, if that had been seen as a positive habit, it might well have been worded more as sharing information from other departments and breaking down silos. But actually, the language there kind of indicated the feeling that this is given. As opposed to giving autonomy and confidence in team decisions, another comment that came through. Well, I'd be amazed if we asked the question, are these good or bad habits? I'd be amazed if the person who commented that said that was a bad habit, because actually there's kind of positive language in it. And what I heard you say just then, Zach, was not role modeling, as was almost being presented as a habit. And that, again, it's kind of obvious to me, and I might be completely wrong, but it seems obvious to me that you don't see that as a positive habit. You would see role modeling as a good habit. So
yeah, exactly. And so, sorry, Joe. So really, in the kind of key things for people to think about, in addition to what you just said, was when you are considering your own habits, which I will be urging you to continue to do throughout the remainder of this webinar. Think about the output of that habit. What is it you're trying to achieve with that habit? If it's something positive for you that you want as an output, then consider whether that habit is moving you towards the output. If it's something for your team or for your work or a business goal, is it something that's leading towards that? In which case, as long as it is benefiting the end goal whilst encouraging those people around you, then it's going to be a good habit.
Can I just throw one more point into that as well? I think the other key thing is, if you are clear on what the output is, which is absolutely you should be, particularly when it comes to doing things to have a positive outcome for your team, it's good to communicate about why you're doing the thing that you're doing regularly. So, to give an example, to come back to the example of, gossiping about other departments, well, actually, sharing information about other departments could be interpreted as gossiping if it was presented in the wrong way. So, I think being clear on why you're doing things. So another example might be if you're taking Friday afternoons off and working an extra hour each day. So working an extra hour each day could be interpreted by the rest of the team as, oh, my line manager wants me to stay late. That's the role model piece that they could interpret. But actually what you mean by that is, actually, I want you to take some time for yourself, and I'm role modeling taking some time for myself, but I know I need to get the work done. So it's about communicating what you mean by what the intention of your actions is, as well as being clear about what they are for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. There's it's a habit. If I want to create a habit, it must be simple. It must be easy, surely. But of course it's not. It can be extraordinarily difficult to create or adapt, change, or grow particular habits. So another quick thinking piece for everybody. Think of a time when you tried to implement a habit generally. It doesn't have to be linked to a positive work habit, doesn't even have to be linked to work for this, but let's try and identify a habit which you tried to change or implement and you didn't succeed in doing so. What made it hard to turn this thing into a habit? And whilst you're typing in, Joe and I will chat about our own habits. Now, Joe, I have a habit. Oh my gosh, that was an automatic sentence that came out of my mouth there. I think it probably is a habit. I have a habit of exposing myself a bit too much on webinars, of being a bit too free and open with information. So I've thought about this, and I feel that habits can be hard to form or particularly hard to change, perhaps because I throw barriers in. For example, I don't have the time. Time management can be a particular barrier for me in making habits. You know, for example, I want to get up in the morning and go for a run. I will put barriers up there. Also, procrastination for me particularly can be quite a difficult barrier, something stopping me implementing habits. And I'll come to the reason why that is in a minute. We've got a couple of comments coming through here. We've got fear of failure, which is what it's got to be one of the main ones. That's interesting. Ineffective reward. So we'll talk about reward a bit more later on, but habits definitely are easier to implement when there is a bit like, here's me overexposing myself, a bit like when you train a dog. You know, you give the dog a reward for good behavior. It's the same with forming habits with us. We do like to be rewarded when we achieve something useful.
And here's another point. So trying to get fit, I went too big at first and got myself discouraged. So I went in too fast, expected too much of myself, and expected the results to come too quickly. I completely agree with that. I've done that many times. And just from my perspective, one of the things that I find erodes my ability to develop new habits is, I think you could call it the sort of shiny and new syndrome. So it's kind of like, you know, when you first start it, you want to do everything all at once. You want to buy all the new kit. So, you know, you start jogging and you start the couch to 5K even, and you're like, right, I need the running shoes. I need, and it's the height of summer, but I still need running tights. Do I put the shorts on over them or under them? And, you know, all of this. And then by the time you've bought all the kit, you've sort of exhausted yourself and exhausted your interest in it because I've been applying the energy in the wrong place. Rather than just learning to do it and getting used to the rhythm of it, I've been going onto eBay or going onto Amazon and buying all this kit. It's arrived and it's exciting, and then it's like, I'm sort of bored of this now. So I think the shiny and new thing, it leads to a sort of fatigue with the whole concept of the habit that you're trying to
correct
form. And I think also with habits, you know, we just talked about good and bad. So there's also the point around breaking habits as well. And I think that piece around reward really speaks into that, because often we have a habit because we get some sort of reward from it. Breaking, or we feel we're getting some sort of reward from it, like whether it's smoking or, you know, eating particular foods or drinking or whatever it is, playing computer games. These things are giving us a reward, and the feeling of a reward, and what we need to do is learn how to overcome that feeling of the reward in favor of a more positive reward for the longer term.
Exactly. So there is something called the desire balance scale, and essentially if your desire to implement the habit isn't stronger than the pull not to do the habit, then it won't succeed. So we need to find some way to generate that desire for the output we want. Otherwise your habits, I'm afraid, will not succeed. But there is some science behind this. Hooray. As you know, Joe, I'm very left brain dominant. I'm very science focused. No, I actually quite like the science. And particularly around the brain, I'm pretty passionate. There have been numerous studies of both how animal and human brains make a habit of tasks and routines. And that's studies of everyone from children to those with degenerative brain diseases, like, for example, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, to the routines of I'm going to have to do the bunny quotes, successful people, depending on how you measure success. And what we can assume from all the various studies is that if we align positive habits with the completion of tasks, which move us along the line towards a successful achievement of our goals, then our goals will be achieved more effortlessly and powerfully. If we make that assumption, then we can start to create a framework through which we can change habits. It was Goethe, J.W. Goethe, who said, everything is hard before it's easy. So that's everything is hard before it's easy. So for example, remember, for those of you who can drive, remember when you first learned to drive, it was very confusing. There were pedals, there were things you had to do with your hands, you had to think about indicating and looking in your mirror. And now, for lots of you, it'll be more or less automatic. When you put on your socks in the morning, you don't necessarily think, where does this go? Does it go on my hand? Does it go on my arm? Where is it? It's a sock. So you automatically put it on without too much proactive conscious thoughts. And that's because it's been made absolutely normalized. We'll dig into a bit more detail on that now. But I'd love you, don't worry about writing it into the chat, but just consider and hold in your mind a positive habit that you have that takes no effort, and start to consider what it is about that habit that makes it so easy. And hold that habit as we'll be looking at habit cycles in just a moment. Now, we'll just talk about it quickly, Joe, but Edvard de Bono, who lots of you may know for his Six Thinking hats, he had a similar angle to habits in some ways. So he thought about the mind being very much like a mountain. And if we remember back to our geography O levels or GCSEs, we know about erosion, that thoughts come down onto the mountain, much like rain does onto a mountain. The mountain is our brain, and then of course over time it erodes into the brain. It forms rivulets, which then form rivers, and that's very much like, in some ways, habits. And so he did talk a little bit about habits in this way, in that we become so ingrained into that river of thinking, that way of seeing and approaching the world in a particular habit, that becomes automatic. The process of going through that task becomes automated as a habit. So it's a very similar thing that we use in design thinking all the time. But let's look in more detail, while you're holding that thought, everybody, about the basal ganglia, which I know is on the front of everyone's tongues there. So one of the common denominators in all those experiments that have been done over the years is the activity observed in the brain scans of the basal ganglia during periods of learning, particularly. So for example, it was in the 90s, researchers at MIT conducted experiments with rats, and those rats were placed in a T-shaped run. So they were placed at the bottom of the T. They begin at the bottom of the long end of the T, behind a door. Now, when there was a loud clicking noise, the door would open and the rat would proceed towards the end of the long stretch, and he'd have a choice to go either left or right. And on the left was a treat, and on the right was nothing. Now, to begin with, the rats would pause along the way. They'd be sniffing around, even though there was nowhere for them to go at that stage until they got to the end. Or they'd turn right at the end, exploring, or they'd turn left and they'd get the treat. And after finding the treat, the experiment with the rats was repeated multiple times, and the rats would invariably and increasingly go directly after the click to the treat, more directly without exploring. And what's interesting is that the probes that were in the rat's brains determined that the basal ganglia showed extreme activity while the rat was exploring. Now, just for information, the basal ganglia is a series of different regions right just at the bottom of the cerebral part of the brain, which basically form habits. And so the rats would show extreme activity in the basal ganglia while they were exploring. But as they went through this T-shaped maze over and over again, it became easier and the basal ganglia activity declined. But the habit was formed and it became easier for them to get the treat. There were three things we need to think about. Firstly, they had a trigger. Now, the trigger was the click. That was when the door opened. The behavior was to travel efficiently to that left-hand turn at the end of the T, and the reward was the treat. Now, our habits work in exactly the same way. So if we can find a way to manipulate this triangle, this cycle, we'll be able to more control our habits. So if we can control our habits, we can become stronger and more effective leaders. In the earlier slide, we said that Leadership 4.0 leaders leading in habit were self-aware, curious, consistent, and adaptable. Now, this is the moment when we can use our self-awareness to exercise curiosity about our habits and how they impact those around us, so that we can develop consistency in our approach. So that habit, or a habit you may identify that you want to change, in a minute, we're going to come to thinking about, can we identify the trigger, the behavior, and the reward or replace some of those things as we go along. So let's just think about reward. Exercise is a really interesting example, Joe, when you were talking about running, because not that many people enjoy the pain of running to start off with until it becomes a habit. But if we want to enhance our own habits, if we want to lose bad habits or create new ones, we need to understand that cycle, that trigger, behavior, and reward, and change one or more of those to make it strong. So I've tried to change habits, a lot of them, over the last months of lockdown. And I think I've got an example for you. I had a habit I wanted to change, which was to be less reactive at work. I got into a bit of a rut where I was reacting to things rather than being proactive. There were things in my diary, but it didn't feel like I was prepared enough in advance. So what I did was I firstly identified the trigger that I wanted to create a habit. So I was creating one from scratch to be more proactive. And I thought about it for a long time. And I thought I could create a trigger on the morning of the day I was doing some work, but actually I did something the night before. So the trigger I created was to be clear on task planning the night before the next day. So I was able to then plan my day. The trigger became opening or bringing to the front of the screen Microsoft Planner, which is a software we use here at the Innovation Beehive, and To Do, which is another Microsoft software. So MS Planner organizes and sets tasks for a particular project, and To Do, you can prioritize them for the next day. The second part of the behavior that I identified was to review my list of tasks for projects and allocate them to do. And that meant my subconscious could passively incubate them overnight, and then I could approach with a clear plan for the next day. The reward was closing down my laptop, signaling clearly the end of the day, and then I was done. And that meant I had a clear set of tasks for the next day, which I wasn't doing before. So that was a new habit for me. The output actually was a calmer, much more purposeful approach to my day. So start to consider, everyone, what habits you've adopted or what would you like to adopt, particularly as a leader, things which might support trust or credibility or a perception of stability.
And
So the first step,
we've just had a question come through just on the subject of reward.
Yeah.
So it's basically, they're saying, is reward always a positive, or can reward be sometimes the avoidance of a negative? Does that make sense? So that's what
yeah. It makes total sense. And in some ways, my closing the laptop last thing is aligned to that. Because what I'm doing there is signaling to myself, right, I prepared for the next day, close the laptop, it's all over. So that's not exactly, it's not necessarily a positive thing. It's also a, okay, I'm done habit. So yes, it can be let's say something final. Hope that answered the question. If not, do you?
I think so. And just to I think maybe broaden out the question a little bit. There might be sometimes when we feel the need to form a habit. So I'm thinking of like leading in head. Now we've just been, imagine you've just been set a really high target by your CEO, what feels like a fairly unrealistic target, and you know that it's make or break, and if you don't hit the target, it's going to have a serious implication. So the reward would be you've saved your job and you've saved your team, which doesn't necessarily feel like a positive. So do we need to find a way to turn that into a positive in order to use that triangle, or actually is that reward bit a kind of the pleasure versus pain thing? So if I avoid pain, it's almost like a form of pleasure, like the utilitarian approach,
Yes, in theory that would work. Where some people fall down, or a lot of people fall down, is thinking that pain will create habits. And it can do, but it's not as efficient, it's not as effective, and it takes longer. Like learning to run, for example. Your early stages of doing that will, for a lot of people, be painful and not pleasurable. In the back of your mind, you've got something which says, I must do it. I need to do it to remain fit or healthy or whatever it might be. But that need to isn't linked to particularly to a desire, in the same way that, I don't know, giving yourself a chocolate bar afterwards, which you probably shouldn't do, would be. And that's why a lot of people fail at it. You just need to find a different trigger, which we'll talk about in just a second.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that'll connect quite powerfully into the webinar that Angela and I will be running on the 15th of June about leading in history, because that's all about finding your why and finding your purpose. So I guess if you can tie your habit forming to the bigger why and the bigger purpose, then you're kind of halfway there to plug in that part of the triangle, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whilst we've been talking, we've actually had some responses into the question you had on screen. So what habits have you formed? Going to church on a Sunday, habit that nurtures me and makes me pause once a week, and it's almost a ritual of self-care. Or maybe even doing the ironing. I like ironing as it creates order out of chaos. So there's a clear reward there.
Yeah, well, that is an interesting reward, because it's not, it is a pleasure reward for that person. Interesting. So start to consider, everyone, what habits you might like to refine or create around the way that you lead. And it could be anything. Some of these will sing true for some people and not for others. Joe, is there anything that jumps out for you?
I think effective communication is a big one for me, both in terms of the way that I, lead myself in my relationships, but also what I take to be good leadership from others is real clarity on not just what they want from me, but also things like what they're hoping for from conversations. So, I always create agendas and let people know where I'd like us to get to by the end of the interaction that I'm having, and check that they're going to get to where they want to get as well. So that's a big one for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a bit more detail around the trigger behavior and reward for me on that, being more organized, more proactive, more on top of tasks. So actually what I did was I set an alarm on my phone for 5:30 p.m. And I appreciate that I might be working later than that, but if it was a clear day, I'd set an alarm for 5:30 p.m. And when that alarm goes off, I'd review any flagged emails, created tasks, Microsoft Planner items, which had come up during the day, and I move them. Don't know if you know the software, but I move them from Microsoft Planner into To Do in a list for tomorrow. And then that's synced across all my devices. I'd prioritize them. And then when I was happy that that's what it is, and my brain was able to work on it overnight, then I would close the laptop and it was done. So that was for me, that felt like a reward, because it was a clear signal, even though it wasn't pure pleasure. I enjoy working. It was a clear signal. So everyone, think about what you might like to adapt.
So we've got one here. I'd like to get better at putting in regular team meetings. We do have them, but they're not held consistently, and I'm not always sure they're useful for everyone. So that's an interesting one. There's quite a few different ones going on there, I guess. There's a piece around developing my team. There's a piece around effective communication. There's also a self-awareness inherent in that comment, I think, because there's an awareness that there's something not quite working. And actually, self-awareness is probably the first habit to develop, because from that, all of the other needs that you can identify will come. And building a high-performing team, I think team meetings are one way of doing that. And just to build on the comment there, if building a high-performing team is your intended outcome there, then maybe there are other ways you can think of to do that as well. So maybe get innovative around thinking about how to build a high-performing team for your people. And thanks. Yeah.
Well, Joe, why don't we help this person out a bit more? So, and everyone listening in, identify your habit. If you have a pen, write it down, and then just make some notes around your habit, identifying the trigger, what you think the trigger is, identifying the behavior, and identifying the reward. Firstly, if you're creating a habit from scratch, create the trigger, behavior, and reward. Write down what you think would work for you. If you're changing a habit, firstly, identify the triggers, the trigger, reward, behavior, and reward, and then change one of them that you think is most achievable to change. So if we don't know the full situation, Joe, the person who made that comment about regular team meetings, but perhaps we could riff some suggestions. So
within this framework, would the phrase hold regular team meetings be the desired behavior? Would that go into that category in the triangle?
It could. There are multiple ways of doing it. So the behavior could be actually an output from that meeting. So the trigger could be, for example, something as simple as diarizing that team meeting more regularly and then sticking to what was in the diary. But that might be a challenge for that person. So it's quite difficult to say. But if we just go one by one and say, for example, the trigger could be settings in stone in the diary, the meeting to start off with. That's a pure trigger. Something would flash up on your screen, and then the behavior might be the effectiveness of the meeting afterwards, rather than just the meeting going ahead. So then the behavior might be sending out an agenda in advance of the meeting, or it might be, or that could be part of the trigger, or it might be getting people to take responsibility in the meeting, could be the part of the behavior. So something, an action that happens.
Right, actually, this person has just added to their comments, so let's use this.
Yeah.
So they said team meeting to ensure we have a sense of community and know how to support each other. So the knowing that we have a sense of community and knowing how to support each other, would that be the reward?
That I would suggest for this person that will be the reward. Yeah, a sense of community.
So let's demonstrate this this model. So if our reward is, our desired future is to create a sense of community in the team, and then knowing how to support each other, well, from that, actually, you could have potential triggers and potential behaviors, not just a team meeting, and that I think is part of the power of this model. So if you imagine your desired future, what it is that you're hoping to achieve, from that you will be able to work out what potential habits you can form and what structures you can put in place to develop the desired behaviors to generate that reward. That's really the purpose of this model, isn't it?
It is, and yes, and you'll find that this will be probably multiple habits leading to that outcome.
Yeah, great. Oh, and he's just added, I tend to put them in at last minute and I don't give people much notice. And I guess that there you go, actually. So trigger is I put them in at the last minute, which means people don't have much notice. So the behavior that generates in the team is that they just turn up without having done any preparation, because they haven't had time to do any preparation. So that doesn't actually, you could put a big cross through the arrow leading from behavior to reward there, because you can then see that the trigger was wrong, therefore the behavior was wrong, therefore you didn't generate the reward. So what I would encourage you to do is think about, in the case of your team meetings, think about, how could I change the trigger to generate different behaviors in my team and then generate different rewards? And what you might need to do in order to do that is some self-reflection to say, okay, so why is it that the trigger that I'm using is such a short notice trigger? How can I, what's going on for me that leads me to give my team such short notice, and what do I need to change in my own ways of working?
And the alternative is, of course, to ask your team what they want to get out of the team meetings, so that there is a clear reward.
Absolutely. We just had a comment. Thank you. Very helpful. My pleasure. Hope that was helpful to everybody else as well.
He's going to raise it in the team meeting next week for people. That's very good. Let's just have a quick look at some tips on that as well. So be, again, without knowing the context, as you just experienced with Joe and I, it can be quite difficult to be clear in those three areas. So be clear and specific on the trigger, behavior, and reward. And if you can, write it down. It really helps thinking when you write things down, and adapt more than one cycle stage if needed. If you need to abandon multiple stages in order to create or adapt a habit, do it. And I'm afraid to say you will absolutely fail. Habits will fall by the wayside, and that's usually because of that desire balance scale, which means that it'll be thrown out of whack, and you either need to increase the balance, increase the desire, or somehow change the habit so that the reward is better. And lastly, don't beat yourself up. Instead, pick yourself up. And try again to implement the habit or adjust something before you implement it. Now, with Joe, we were talking about perhaps that this suggestion that this team meeting thing was too big, and it might be broken down into smaller things. It's much like setting goals in an organization. I mean, realistically, if the habit you're trying to change is, for example, physiological as well as psychological, for example, a substance addiction of some sort, for example, smoking, then you might find that a different habit change method is somehow better, like hypnotherapy or something else. In my example that I gave of trying to be more organized by planning the night before, it wasn't an immediate change. And surprisingly, even that for me was a big, almost like a big goal in work. I needed to break it down into something a little bit smaller. What's that famous phrase, Joe? How do you eat an elephant?
Slice by slice.
Slice by slice. So it's exactly the same with habits. It's a bit like running a marathon. You wouldn't just try and run a marathon without training for a period of time, breaking it down into micro goals to improve your fitness or increase stamina and so on. So to begin with, I just all I wanted to do at the end of the day was to open the software. And it took a few days of doing that before that became a little bit more ingrained, not a habit, but more ingrained. And then eventually sort of adding tasks and starting to organize my data at the end of the day. And it grew and grew. So try to sense check as you're examining those 3 stages. If any of your changes are too big in some way, if they're too unachievable, and just break it down into smaller chunks. That would be
Can I give an example of a micro habit? So I'm learning to play piano, and I've been doing so since August 2019. I've got my grade 3 exam coming up in July, fingers crossed. Because of COVID, I haven't actually done grades 1 and 2. So it's either going to be a great success or a real shock to the system. But the micro habit I want to talk about is an app. I realized that I was practicing really intermittently. So what I did, rather than say I'm going to put aside some time each day or anything like that, knowing my life and the way that I work, that wouldn't work. But what I did was I downloaded an app to my phone called Time Toggle Track, which is a timer app. And every time I go to the piano, the micro habit that I've adopted is that I time myself. So even if I only do 2 to 3 minutes and I just run through the pieces that I'm learning once each, I time it. And then by the end of the day, I look back and I've done sort of 25, 30 minutes. And then on weekends, I might do an hour in one go and really focus in. And over the course of the week, I can then see how much time I have allocated. And I think that is absolutely the trigger, the behavior, the reward piece, because, you know, the trigger was the realization I needed to spend more time playing piano. And then the individual trigger for each time I go to the piano is, oh, I haven't done enough today, because I can look at the timer. The behavior isn't playing the piano, but it's actually pressing the button on my phone to record the time. The reward is that at the end of the day or at the end of the week, I get to see how much piano I've practiced. So I think that's an example of a micro habit. The macro thing, the elephant, is that I'm going to pass the grade 3 exam. One of the tiny micro habits isn't even, you know, doing the D major scale. It's simply pressing the button on my phone. It's that small. That's the kind of micro habit that we're talking about here.
Exactly. I had exactly the same with learning and development, slightly bigger, slightly bigger micro habits, but I wanted to increase my own learning and development. And so I thought, well, I'll just learn from a CD. I'll make that a habit. But of course, that's way too big. So actually what I did was, I made some notes here. What I did was, firstly, I picked a topic, which in this case was time management. And then to create the trigger, the behavior and the reward, I just went step by step. So my first step was getting in the car, opening the car door. I made that a trigger. And then I would put a CD, I still have a CD player in my car. So I put the CD into the car. It happened to be Brian Tracy's time management program. So that became then my behavior. So I opened the door, put it as the trigger, put in the CD as the behavior, and the reward was, when I got to the shop, I gave myself a little treat. And of course, that then made it much easier to learn. But that leads us on, Joe, to routines, because I had this great idea. I've actually got it here on the wall. I won't hold it up too long so you see my early morning routine. But I had this idea, I write Post-it notes everywhere with a list of things I wanted to get done before 8 a.m. in the morning. And I thought, it's a routine. Lots of people have routines. Even this dancer has a routine. It must be easy to use routines to implement habits. But of course, it wasn't that easy. I mean, habitualized routines can help us to be more effective leaders, but it's a bit like you were saying before, it's about the size of it, whether or not we can eat that entire elephant. The goal, I suppose, is automating certain tasks. You know, I like to use my pre-8 a.m. mornings to become more knowledgeable and organized. Of course, we know now I do part of it the night before. I felt that having some sort of routine might save us time. So a routine I wanted to put in place was, you know, I've got plenty of lists to try and standardize things. So it would be, for example, waking up, checking and replying to social media, exercising, listening to a podcast, drinking water, getting coffee, reviewing HR news, replying to WhatsApp groups, making breakfast, listening to world news and the financial markets, checking flagged emails, clearing down photos, and then starting my working day. And I thought, great, if I can get all this stuff done every day, I'm going to be on top of the world. Do you think I've been successful? No. If anyone wants to type into the chat what they think the challenge is, feel free, but I think it's fairly obvious. Joe, what do you think the challenge is?
Well, Zach, I think you made a spreadsheet, which I know you're not a big fan of, for one thing. I also think setting yourself such ambitious goals before you even claim you're starting the work day is probably biting off a bit more of that elephant than you can chew.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
a comment has
couldn't do
just
that.
come through. You'd start work exhausted, absolutely, and I think it'd be quite stressful to do this. And the implication of it is that, you know, if you're going to work exhausted, even if you've been doing all of these hours, if you go to work exhausted and, you know, you kind of hit a wall by 2 o'clock, people may actually lose confidence in you. Oh, and a great comment has just come through as well. From doing all of the things that you're doing before 8 a.m. in the morning, well, what's the actual reward? Where's, you know, within the framework that we've been talking about?
And this is exactly the summary of what we've been talking about, because I thought the reward would be me being on top of information, me being able to know about everything, me being able to know what's going on in the financial markets when I don't work in that sector. I'm a business consultant. So actually, what I needed to do was to somehow break it down into things which led to priority goals of mine. So firstly, I had to identify some priority goals, what I wanted to achieve, and it ended up being that thing where I started to plan the night before. So it started huge as a big routine, but eventually came down to something much, much smaller. So some clear action points for everybody from what Joe and I have been discussing so far is start to think about what current habits you have that you might want to adapt or change, or think about what habits around leadership that you don't have right now or aren't effective that you might like to instill and begin and grow, and identify those 3 stages: the trigger, the behavior, and the reward, so you can create those cycles. Fourthly, adapt or change any relevant stage of existing habits, and then break those big habits into micro habits. And if you're building habits into routines, don't try and do so much that it's overwhelming and you do not want to do it, because it's all about that balance. Now, there are other things you might consider, which are roadblocks. There are just quick one on this one, because roadblocks are very individual for different people. And it could be roadblocks are around what you may have seen on a previous webinar that Joe and our colleague Angela did, around what things which are in your control, things which you can influence, and things which you can just accept as being the case. And I think that was leading in heart that we covered that in Joe.
Health.
Leading in health, thank you. And for example, it might be, if I was looking to be better with my time management, is that in my control? That's in my control. So having clarity on that means that I'm able to lift the roadblocks. But even if it's something which isn't in my direct control, it could be that something which I could be influenced by or help influence, or it could be something I can just accept and move forwards. But that knowledge is going to help. If it's perhaps a mental block, it could be around the desire to change. So for example, that desire balance scale, you have to make sure that you can increase the desire so that you're more likely to move forwards with it. That could mean increasing the reward, or it could just mean a better awareness and understanding of what the output is going to be. So whatever the roadblocks are, just identify them and try and work out what you can change. And if you can't change it, try and work out how you can increase the reward so you're more likely to do it. The final thing from me is, in some ways, your habit and your habits are very much like your bank balance. And what I mean by that is, leading in habit is not a kind of one and done affair. It's not something that you can say, right, I put in place that habit now, I'm a successful leader. Of course it's not. Habits, like your bank balance, they need continual attention. You need to check them regularly and assess them to make sure that you have enough habits in the red, what's in the black rather than in the red. That way you can make sure they're aligned with your leadership goals. You can make sure that they are serving you and your team in the best possible way. And of course, you can make sure, as Joe said at the beginning, that they help you to lead in head, lead in heart, lead in health, and as we'll see in 2 weeks' time, leading in history. That then means that you are, by being self-aware, you are curious about everything around you so that you can create consistency through your habits while still being adaptable, so you can change as needed. Good. Joe, a summary perhaps.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think that was brilliant, and I really hope everyone took a lot from that, particularly thinking about the simple model, relatively simple model for thinking about your habits, thinking about the trigger, the behavior, and the reward, and thinking about how that really thinking about what the reward could be, whether it's avoiding something or gaining something. And if it is about avoiding something, see if you can flip that into a positive in the way you think about it, because actually having a more positive outlook, I think anyone who's tried to give up smoking knows that it's a lot easier to have a sense of gaining something in the life that you're going to have, as opposed to giving up the thing that you're getting rid of, as it were. And then I think the other key thing that Zach has talked about there is micro habits, and breaking down these habits into smaller and smaller chunks. And actually, the smaller the chunk, the easier it is to do. I was talking to someone last week about the phrase about eating an elephant slice by slice, and I was saying I'm not sure that vegans would appreciate that. So another way of thinking about that is, how do you move the mountain? You move it stone by stone. Same principle, and equally valid. There's a great article on our website about it, actually, about how you move the mountain. But I want to share with you the URL that is on the screen right now. So that's leadership40.scoreapp.com. That will take you to the Leadership 4.0 scorecard. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in exploring and developing your habits, to complete that scorecard. The link to it is on our homepage, which I'm just sharing in the chat right now. There you go. And that will give you a free scorecard, which gives you a score in leading in head, heart, health, habit, and history, based on your own self-diagnosis from the questions that are in there. It's still in beta mode. It's been changed since the last time we shared it. So if you have tried it before, and if you've talked to me about it, or if you haven't, but if you'd like to try it again, please do. We've made some tweaks based on the feedback we've received so far, and I think it's a much stronger scorecard now. So please do have another go of that. If it's your first time trying it, please do give it a go, and look out for an email from me in the coming days asking for a quick call to just talk about your thoughts on the scorecard, and also your thoughts on this webinar and the webinar series. One of our behaviors and one of our habits at the Innovation Beehive is to be better than before, and we do that by seeking feedback from the people that we work with and the people who engage with us. So I'll thank you in advance for that. The final thing I want to share with you is on the next slide, just our upcoming webinars. There's only one, but on the page that I've just sent in the chat box, you will find our webinar series, our series on leadership. On that page, you will not find links to webinars that are in the past, but you will actually find YouTube channels, YouTube links to the webinars that have already happened. So do please check out the previous webinars if you haven't seen them already. And we would love to see you on the 15th of June, when I'll be joined by Angela again, when we will talk about leadership making history. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much to you all for taking part in the webinar today and for joining in the chat. And of course, thank you to Zach for taking us through the science and the stories that made today's webinar so engaging. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Joe. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye, everyone.